In 1935, the Nazi SS founded a research division called the Ahnenerbe. Its mission was to prove that an ancient warrior race had once conquered Europe and seeded its civilizations. They were called Aryans. The science was a fabrication. The conclusion was used to justify the Holocaust. 80 years later, geneticists at Harvard sequenced ancient DNA from 1,600 prehistoric skeletons. The findings were uncomfortable. A warrior people had, in fact, swept into Europe around 5,000 years ago. They had replaced large portions of the existing population. And the German archaeologist who first proposed the migration died a hero of the Nazi state. This is the story of how a piece of Nazi-adjacent science turned out to be partly true, and what that does and does not mean. 3 points need to be on the table before we go further. First, a migration is not a master race. The people at the center of this story, known to archaeologists as the Yamnaya, were not Germanic. They were not Aryan in any racial sense. They were not light-skinned. They are not anyone's exclusive ancestors. Roughly half of humanity descends from them in some fraction. Northern Europeans, South Asians, Iranians, Central Asians. No ethnic group on Earth owns this story. Second, Hitler did not get the science right. He landed, by accident, on a piece of geography slightly less wrong than the post-war academic consensus. That is a much weaker claim than Hitler was right. Third, genetic ancestry is not a political claim. The fact that a population entered a region 5,000 years ago does not establish who has the right to live there now. That logical leap, from prehistoric migration to modern political entitlement, is what the Nazis weaponized. It is the entire crime. Migration is not hierarchy. Hold on to that. The man at the center of the original claim was Gustaf Kossinna. Kossinna was born in 1858 in East Prussia. By the 1890s, he held the chair in German archaeology at the University of Berlin and had pioneered an entire methodology, Siedlungsarchäologie, or settlement archaeology. His core argument was that a uniform set of artifacts, pots, axes, burial styles, equaled a uniform people. Track the artifacts, and you could map ancient ethnic groups across the European landscape. In 1902, Kossinna identified the Bronze Age corded ware culture as the original Indo-Europeans. He claimed they were, in his words, Nordic stock, white, blonde, blue-eyed warriors who had ridden out of the north and given the world its civilizations. Kossinna did not stop at archaeology. In an article titled The German Ostmark, Home Territory of the Germans, he argued that Poland was rightfully part of Germany because Germanic-style artifacts had been found in Polish soil. The logic was simple. Find a pot, claim a country. Kossinna died in 1931, 2 years before Hitler took power. He never personally endorsed the Third Reich, but the framework he left behind was ready to use. Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief ideologist, elevated Kossinna's work to state doctrine. In 1935, Heinrich Himmler founded the Ahnenerbe, the Society for Research into Ancestral Heritage, and dispatched SS-affiliated archaeologists across the world, from Iceland to Tibet, searching for traces of the Aryan superpeople. The expeditions forged evidence. They massaged carbon dates. They photographed German peasants and labeled them racially pure types. When the war began, Ahnenerbe officers followed the German army into occupied territory and looted museums for anything that could be reframed as Germanic. This was the intellectual scaffolding behind Lebensraum, the doctrine that Germans had a historic right to the lands of Eastern Europe, and the right to empty those lands of their existing populations. 6 million Jews, millions of Slavs, Roma, and Soviet prisoners of war. The body count of an idea, weaponized. But buried inside Kossinna's racial mythology was a real archaeological observation. Material culture across Bronze Age Europe did shift dramatically. Pottery styles changed. Burial practices flipped. Something happened around 3000 BC that scrambled the continent. Kossinna saw it. What he did with it is what damned him. When the war ended in 1945, archaeology faced a problem. A methodology developed in German universities had just been used to justify genocide. The field's response was to bury it. After 1945, the new orthodoxy had a slogan: pots, not people. Material culture, the field now argued, changes through trade, fashion, and emulation. Ideas travel, people stay put.
Migration arrows on prehistoric maps disappeared. Anyone proposing large-scale population replacement was professionally suspect.
The respectable alternative came from British archaeologist Colin Renfrew. In his 1987 book, Archaeology and Language, Renfrew proposed what is now called the Anatolian hypothesis. Indo-European languages, he argued, did not spread through conquest. They spread peacefully alongside farming, slowly, over thousands of years, out of what is now Turkey. No warriors, no invasions, no bloodshed. The theory fit the post-war mood. It was, we now know, wrong. The most prominent dissenter was Marija Gimbutas, a Lithuanian-American archaeologist at UCLA. From 1956 onward, Gimbutas argued the Kurgan hypothesis, that steppe pastoralists had ridden out of the Pontic-Caspian grasslands around 3000 BC and overrun Neolithic Europe. She was largely correct, but she paired her correct claim with a much more speculative one, that the Europe these horsemen overran had been a peaceful, matriarchal civilization, worshipping a great mother goddess. Evidence for the goddess part was thin. Gimbutas was marginalized, partly for the speculation, partly because the migration claim sounded too close to the Aryan invasion theory the field had spent decades scrubbing off. The lesson is uncomfortable. The post-war consensus was not neutral science correcting an ideology. It was one ideologically motivated stance replacing another. The Nazis wanted Aryan migration to be true because it served conquest. The post-war academic establishment wanted it to be false because false felt safe. Neither stance was driven primarily by evidence. Both were driven by which conclusion the field could afford to reach. In 2015, that changed. In June 2015, two papers landed in the journal Nature, in the same month. The first, led by Wolfgang Hack of David Reich's lab at Harvard, was titled "Massive Migration from the Steppe was a Source for Indo-European Languages in Europe." 69 ancient European genomes have been sequenced. Around 4,500 years ago, a new ancestry component appeared in Central Europe. It accounted for roughly 3/4 of the genetic makeup of the corded ware culture, the same culture Kossinna had identified in 1902.
The second paper, led by Morten Allentoft, was independent. 101 ancient genomes, same conclusion. The source of the new ancestry was a Bronze Age people now known as the Yamnaya. They lived on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, between modern Ukraine and Kazakhstan. They herded cattle and sheep. They built kurgans, large earth-mounded burial tombs that still dot the steppe. They were among the first people on Earth to ride horses, and the first to use ox-drawn wagons. Around 3,300 BC, they began to move. By 3000 BC, Yamnaya-related populations stretched from Hungary to Kazakhstan. By 2800 BC, their descendants had reached Central Europe. By 2400 BC, they had reached Britain. The Britain finding was the one that drew the most attention. In 2018, a paper led by Inigo Olalde, also published in Nature, sequenced 400 ancient British genomes. The conclusion? Roughly 90% of the British gene pool was replaced within a few centuries of the Bell Beaker arrival, around 2450 BC. The people who built Stonehenge, a real population with a distinct genetic profile, almost vanished. Whatever happened, it happened fast. In 2024, Allentoft and an international team brought the total dataset to over 1,600 ancient genomes. The picture did not soften. It sharpened. The Yamnaya migration is now understood as one of the largest and fastest population turnovers in European prehistory. David Reich, who runs the Harvard lab responsible for much of this work, published a book in 2018 titled "Who We Are and How We Got Here." The book is unusually candid. Reich states plainly that the data forced the field back to migrationism and that the post-war consensus had been wrong. He is also explicit on a second point. Ancient genetic ancestry tells us nothing about modern political legitimacy. Reich anticipated how this data could be misused and tried to put a fence around it before anyone else could. In February 2025, the story was rewritten again. On February 5th, Nature published two new landmark papers on the same day. The lead author of the first was Josef Lazaridis, with David Reich and David Anthony as co-authors. The title? The Genetic Origin of the Indo-Europeans.
The team analyzed 435 newly sequenced ancient genomes from across Eurasia, dating between 6,400 and 2000 BC. The finding was this: the Yamnaya themselves had ancestors. A previously unknown population, the Caucasus Lower Volga people, or CLV, lived between the Lower Volga River and the northern foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, between roughly 4,500 and 3,500 BC. They were a mix of Caucasus Neolithic farmers and Eastern European hunter-gatherers. The Yamnaya inherited about 80% of their ancestry from this CLV population. The geographic implication is significant. Kossinna placed the original Indo-Europeans in northern Europe, Scandinavia, the German plain, somewhere near the Baltic. He placed them there because that was where he wanted his Aryans to come from. The 2025 data places the actual point of origin further south and east, against the Caucasus Mountains, with substantial ancestry from Neolithic Anatolia and the Near East. The Yamnaya were not a Nordic people. Their ancestors include populations Kossinna himself would have classified, in his vocabulary, as Mediterranean or Asiatic. The migration was real, the race was a fantasy.
The 2025 paper is not without critics. Linguist Paul Hegarty, in a sharp commentary published the same month, has argued that Lazaridis and his co-authors quietly reclassify the Anatolian languages as a separate Indo-Anatolian branch. A move that, in his view, shifts the goalposts on what counts as Indo-European. The science is still active. Researchers continue to disagree on exactly when and where the language family began to fragment. What no serious researcher now disputes is that a major population movement out of the steppe in the 3rd millennium BC seeded most of the Indo-European speaking world. This brings us to the headline that gave this video its title. In March 2019, New Scientist published an article by science writer Colin Barris under the headline, "Story of the Most Murderous People of All Time, Revealed by Ancient DNA." The article quoted Christian Christensen, a senior archaeologist at the University of Gothenburg, saying he had become, quote, "increasingly convinced there must have been a kind of genocide." According to Christensen, the Yamnaya did not simply migrate, they massacred. They killed the men of the populations they encountered, partnered with the women, and replaced the next generation with their own bloodlines. The evidence for the violence claim rests largely on Y-Chromosome data. In the wake of the Bell Beaker arrival in Britain, male lineages were nearly completely replaced. Female lineages showed much greater continuity with the earlier population. That is the genetic signature one would expect if incoming men killed local men and partnered with local women. It is not the only possible explanation. Extreme reproductive skew, in which a small number of high-status incoming men father a disproportionate share of children over many generations, can produce a similar pattern without anyone being killed. But the data demands an explanation, and violence remains a live possibility. A 2023 paper in Science Advances, led by Martin Troutman, found bone wear patterns consistent with sustained horseback riding among Yamnaya individuals. The military advantage was real. A mounted population fighting people who had never seen a horseman was not a fair fight. But a counter-narrative is gaining ground. In July 2024, Frederick Seersholm and an international team published a paper in Nature titled "Repeated Plague Infections Across 6 Generations of Neolithic Farmers." The team sequenced 108 Scandinavian Neolithic individuals. 17% of them, nearly 1 in 5, had Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, in their bodies at the time of death. Plague was already spreading through Neolithic farming communities in Scandinavia in the centuries before the Yamnaya arrived. This finding reframes the picture. The Neolithic decline, a documented population collapse across northern Europe between 5,300 and 4,900 years ago, may have been driven by disease, not by warriors. By the time the Yamnaya arrived, large parts of Europe may have been half empty. Mega-settlements abandoned, fields untended. The Yamnaya may not have been walking into thriving villages and slaughtering the inhabitants. They may have been walking into ruins. The leading scientific skeptic of the genocide framing is Volker Heide, an archaeologist at the University of Helsinki. Heide does not dispute the genetic replacement. He disputes the violence narrative wrapped around it, and has argued that the field, and especially the press, have overtold the story. The honest answer, as of 2026, is this. Violence was almost certainly part of the story. The Y-chromosome data is too lopsided to fully explain any other way.
But violence was not the whole story. Disease arrived first, in many places. Demographic collapse opened the door. Reproductive monopolies by incoming elites stacked on top of straightforward warfare. There was no single cause. There was a cascade. And the cascade ran in the migrants' favor. Were they the most murderous people of all time? Almost certainly not. The 20th century holds that record, and it is not close. Were they violent participants in a continent-scale population replacement? The data says yes. This is the part of the story that requires the most caution. There are people on the internet using the Yamnaya findings to argue for some version of white European supremacy. The argument runs as follows. Ancient warriors of the steppe conquered and replaced inferior populations. Their descendants, meaning in the speaker's imagination modern white Europeans, are heir to a heritage of dominance. This is Kossinna with a 23andMe account. It is the same logical move. It is wrong for the same reasons. 3 corrections, drawn directly from the published research. First, the Yamnaya were not Germanic. They were not Nordic. They were not white in any modern sense. They carried Caucasus Neolithic ancestry, meaning they had ancestors from regions Hitler would have classified as Asiatic. Their living descendants include populations from Iceland to Bangladesh. No nation, no ethnic group, no race owns this inheritance. Second, genetic ancestry does not grant political legitimacy. The fact that a population entered a region 5,000 years ago says nothing about who has the right to live there now. That leap is the leap Kossinna made. That leap is the leap the Nazis made. It is the entire crime. Third, every modern population is the product of multiple migrations, including violent ones. The Yamnaya replaced the Neolithic farmers of Europe. The Neolithic farmers had themselves replaced the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, who had replaced earlier populations, all the way back through Neanderthal admixture and out of Africa. There is no original native group at the bottom of the stack. First arrival is a fiction at every layer. A migration shaped Europe. That is true. It licenses nothing. That is also true. Both have to stay on the table at the same time, or the pattern that produced Kossinna repeats itself. Which raises a final question. How does a field handle being right for the wrong reasons? Because that is what happened here. Kossinna saw a real pattern in the archaeological record. He wrapped it in a racial mythology that helped justify mass murder. After the war, the field threw out the pattern, along with the mythology, because keeping the pattern felt morally indistinguishable from keeping the mythology. 70 years later, the genetic evidence forced the pattern back onto the table, stripped of the ideology. The problem is more common in the history of science than the textbook story admits. Lamarck was wrong about the mechanism of inheritance, but right that organisms change across generations. Phlogiston theorists were wrong about the substance, but right that something is exchanged in combustion. Continental drift was rejected for decades, partly because Alfred Wegener was a meteorologist, and the geological establishment did not want to be lectured by an outsider. The truth does not care who is holding it. It does not care if the wrong people will be pleased. The post-war archaeological consensus was not ideology-free science correcting an ideology. It was one ideologically motivated stance replacing another. The Nazis wanted Aryan migration to be true because it served conquest. The post-war field wanted it to be false because false meant safe. Neither was a position arrived at by following the data. The discipline required is not the avoidance of ideologically loaded conclusions. It is the separation of the factual claim from the political claim, every single time. A migration happened. That does not mean anyone owns Europe. A people were violent. That does not mean their descendants inherit the violence. A theory was associated with fascists. That does not make the theory wrong. And a theory turning out to be correct does not retroactively make the fascists right about anything else. The question worth asking now is harder. What other claims is science currently holding at arm's length because of who would be pleased to hear them? And how do we tell the difference between a claim being suppressed because it is false and a claim being suppressed because acknowledging it would feel like a moral surrender? The Yamnaya story is a clean case study because the dust has settled and the data is in. It is almost certainly not the only case. It is the one currently visible in retrospect. The lesson is not that the Nazis were secretly right about anything. The Nazis were not right about anything that matters. The lesson is that being right about the wrong question, or right for the wrong reasons, is one of the ways human knowledge moves forward. A field that cannot acknowledge this, a field that confuses moral hygiene with empirical rigor, will eventually be embarrassed by its own data. In this case, it took 70 years. Sources for everything in this report, every paper, every book, every quote, are linked in the description. For a deeper read, the recommended starting points are David Reich's Who We Are and How We Got Here, the February 2025 Lazaridis paper in Nature, and Paul Hegarty's commentary on it. A migration is not a hierarchy. A fact is not a permission slip. And being right for the wrong reasons is still being wrong about the part that matters.